This is the first program of the year, so for those of you that were all hyped up to come and to this last month, I apologize that there was this minor government shutdown that I had nothing to do with, by the way, but did affect us, and so I do apologize that we weren't able to do the program as scheduled last month. But you know, with all hope that everything will work out well by the end of this week, hopefully we can avoid that for the indefinite future. So we actually like our jobs, and we want to be working, and we want to be down the street at the site and doing things like coming out and doing programs like this. So believe it or not, we would much rather be at work than not at work. So I'm very pleased to be here today. As always, I'm very pleased that we have pretty much a full house here. So gosh, I can't imagine why that would be. Because no one's ever heard of Joshua Chamberlain, right? Chamberlain is a fascinating guy, and obviously with only 40 minutes or whatever we've got, this is always just kind of a very, very cursory look at someone's life. But if anything, we're in a library, so hopefully you'll at least learn enough here that maybe you want to go upstairs and check out some books after the program. Chamberlain is, as I said, a fascinating guy. He's a guy that has really grown in popularity over the last, let's say, 30 to 40 years or so. When I was young and I was first getting interested in history, I naively thought that I discovered Joshua Chamberlain. So as I was starting to do all of this reading as a teenager, when I was really getting interested in this history, I found this guy, and I was learning all about the Battle of Gettysburg, and I found this guy, and I just thought, boy, I can't believe more people don't know about this guy. And then I think the next book I read was The Killer Angels, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, somebody does know about Joshua Chamberlain. So interestingly, though, his popularity has kind of seen peaks and valleys over the the 100 and some years, 105 years since his death. He was very famous in his lifetime, and then after he died, his fame kind of faded, and then kind of was brought back by Killer Angels, and certainly by the film adaptation. So I want to talk a little bit about some of his his life, his accomplishments. As always, I'll at the end, if I could ask everybody to hold questions till the end, because some of you may actually have to have other places to be this afternoon. Sometimes we can go pretty far down the rabbit hole with questions, but I'm available to stay as long as you want. So at the end, if you have questions, I'll try to take questions. I have a complicated relationship with Chamberlain, if I'm being completely honest. As I said, when I found him as a teenager, I got really interested in him, and I thought he was this sort of, mythic, almost god walking among the earth, and how did more people not know about him? And then I read The Killer Angels, and I saw the film Gettysburg, and I started working for the National Park Service at Gettysburg National Military Park. And these things were all happening right around the same time. So after the film came out, people were showing up at Gettysburg in droves wanting to know about Joshua Chamberlain. And as a young college intern working the front desk, talking to thousands of people every day, I'll be honest, I got really sick of talking about Joshua Chamberlain. I got tired of answering questions that were based on fiction. And, The Killer Angels is my favorite book of all time. I mean, it's the book that made me want to be a historian. But it's a novel. And Michael Shera, the author, was very open about that. This is a dramatization. It's a novel. The film adaptation, called simply Gettysburg, is an adaptation of a novel. But people would come to Gettysburg, and they, were convinced that, Chamberlain must have commanded the Army of the Potomac at some point, and wanting to know where was the equestrian statue of Chamberlain, and, when did he, walk on water and perform his other miracles, and all of these other things. And so then this guy that I had really loved as a younger person, I started to kind of despise a little bit. And I wrote a master's thesis about him that was not very kind, I have to admit. And now, years later, I've kind of managed to find the middle ground with Joshua Chamberlain. So hopefully, as we go through today, you'll kind of see that at least I'm being somewhat fair, and I am taking the middle ground with Joshua Chamberlain. So Joshua Chamberlain, for you who don't know, is this guy. Oh, wait, that's not really Joshua Chamberlain, is it? That, of course, is Jeff Daniels playing Joshua Chamberlain in the film Gettysburg. I'm betting most of you, if you're interested in the Civil War even a little bit, have seen the film. It's a very long film, but I have to say, for me, the highlight still is the Chamberlain character played by Jeff Daniels. I mean, talk about a perfect casting choice. He looks like him. He's got the New England, Boston or Maine accent down very well. And of course, he plays Chamberlain very heroically, which is also the way that Michael Scherer wrote the character in The Killer Angels. So to me, Jeff Daniels was a perfect choice for this role and did a fantastic job. I don't feel that way about all of the casting choices in that movie. But I think Jeff Daniels was actually an inspired choice for this film. So imagine, as I'm as a young man, kind of in the throes of my fascination with Chamberlain and Gettysburg, about a year after this movie comes out, guess what comes out? Dumb and Dumber. How many of you seen Dumb and Dumber? Well, it's a whole different character for Jeff Daniels in Dumb and Dumber, isn't it? So I remember watching that, and there's some scenes in there that are pretty, questionable, we'll say, and thinking, this guy is Joshua Chamberlain? Oh no! Because I didn't want Jeff Daniels to ever take another role. I thought he should have just retired and been Joshua Chamberlain forever. So, great performance by Daniels in that movie, though. Really an inspired choice for Chamberlain. So let's talk a little bit about the real Joshua Chamberlain, not the Joshua Chamberlain that we've seen in the pages of novels and on screen. So Joshua Chamberlain, and I'll call him Joshua Chamberlain just because that's what everybody calls him, but in reality he actually went by his middle name. Most of his family and friends called him Lawrence, which was his middle name, so he was a middle name guy. But born in September of 1828 in Maine, and he's the oldest of 5 children. His parents are Joshua and Sarah. His father actually has a fairly interesting ancestry. He can trace, I read where Joshua Chamberlain's father could trace his ancestry all the way back to the 1100s in England. So has a very, very long lineage that he comes from. Because he was the oldest, probably, he was his mother's favorite. But his father was very hard on him. And if you read any biographies of Chamberlain, there's all kinds of stories about just how hard his dad was on him. So it was not necessarily an easy life for a young Joshua Chamberlain. Very, very close to his mother, but his father was often very hard on him. Both of his great-grandfathers were veterans of the Revolutionary War, including one who fought at Yorktown. This image here, of course, is Washington receiving Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown. One of his grandfathers, also named Joshua Chamberlain, fought in the War of 1812, and then his own father served in the Aroostook War, which was a conflict with the British up in Maine in the late 1830s, about where the border of that territory should be. And you can see on this, it's kind of hard to see, but this is Maine right here, and you can see some different interpretations of where the two sides thought the border should be. And so that was the elder Joshua Chamberlain's military experience. And probably partially because of his own experience, partially because of the experience of his own grandfathers, Joshua Chamberlain's father very much wanted him to pursue a military career, which of course came to be very, a very prescient choice later in the young Chamberlain's life. His mother went the other way and hoped he would be a minister. In fact, there are, and I should have mentioned it at the beginning, one of the reasons I think now I'm so interested in Chamberlain, as somebody who is at this point in my life, is that I think there are a lot of parallels between Chamberlain and James Garfield. Garfield, who considered a career in the ministry and did in fact preach at a number of Disciples of Christ churches here in Northeast Ohio. And then as we go through, there are some other parallels between Chamberlain and Garfield. Lots of differences too, but certainly a lot of parallels. But at any rate, Chamberlain wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his own life, but clearly his parents, as we often do as parents, don't we? We know what we want our kids to do, and they just need to listen to us and do what we tell them. And of course, then we get married, and then we expect our spouses to tell us what they want us to do, and they expect us to do that. And you'll see that didn't work out for Joshua Chamberlain either. As he got older, Chamberlain eventually matriculated to Bowdoin College, still there, I see somebody's got a Bowdoin sweatshirt on over here, so I better say nothing but good things about Bowdoin. Which actually, I don't know much about Bowdoin. I've never been there, so there's not really anything bad I could say. Chamberlain goes to Bowdoin, starts there in 1848, and the entrance exams were notoriously rigorous, and he actually had to learn ancient Greek and Latin just to take the entrance exams to get into Bowdoin. So a little different than today, where you might have to take the SAT or the ACT, but in fact, he had to learn two completely new languages just to pass the entrance exam to get into Bowdoin College. Bowdoin has a number of famous alums from the Civil War era. Chamberlain, of course. Oliver Howard, who was the commander of the 11th Corps at Gettysburg, went to Bowdoin. William Pitt Fessenden, who was a very important senator from Maine, was a Bowdoin graduate. And then in the more modern times, there are a number of William Cohen, who was Secretary of Defense under the Clinton administration for a while, is a Bowdoin graduate. So Bowdoin's private, pretty exclusive school up in Maine, still a very highly regarded school. Now, while Chamberlain was at Bowdoin, he met Calvin Stowe, who was one of the professors there, professor of religion, and that was a very important person for him to meet. Calvin Stowe, very smart, very highly regarded in the Bowdoin community, but the thing that really impacted Chamberlain even more was meeting Calvin Stowe's wife, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who later became the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin. So at the time that Joshua Chamberlain is attending Bowdoin College and he's getting to know the Stowes and he's going over to their house, he actually gets to sit there and listen to Harriet Beecher Stowe read early versions of what eventually became Uncle Tom's Cabin. And of course, if you know anything about Uncle Tom's Cabin, it is this, this powerful novel about the, the evils of slavery. And in fact, it's probably apocryphal, but there's that great story about Lincoln meeting Harriet Beecher Stowe at one point during the Civil War and saying, "Oh, so you're the little lady that started this big war," meaning, referring to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So Joshua Chamberlain really got to sort of sit in the front row of this, major piece of American literature being produced. In fact, Uncle Tom's Cabin was, for decades, the best-selling American novel of the 19th century, and it was eventually surpassed by, anybody know? Anybody know? Ben-Hur. And who was the author of Ben-Hur? Lew Wallace, who also fought in the Civil War, and was minister to the Ottoman Empire under President James A. Garfield. So, as I said, give me enough time, I can always find a connection. So Chamberlain graduates from Bowdoin in 1852. Knowing that his mother still wants him to be a minister, he does go to the Theological Seminary in Bangor, Maine for a few years. Graduates from there, but never does actually become a minister. And there's a letter that he wrote to his wife at one point after they were married saying, I don't know that I'll ever actually be a minister. So even though he went to the Theological Seminary and had a very strong religious faith for the rest of his life, he never actually became a minister. He found himself more drawn to academia than to the ministry, again, kind of like James Garfield. So he actually, after finishing at the Theological Seminary, returns to Bowdoin as a professor. And he's teaching, at that time, teaching rhetoric. Eventually teaches just about everything Bowdoin has to offer other than math. And so obviously was very intellectual, very well-versed in all different fields, again, similar to James Garfield, and really settled into what was a very nice academic life as a professor at Bowdoin. And as you can see there, in addition to English, of course, he was fluent in 9 other languages. That's pretty impressive. So, and again, like James Garfield, we talk all the time down the street about Garfield's proficiency with languages. I think Chamberlain has even Garfield beat, though. I don't think Garfield was quite at 9. He might have been at 5 or 6, but I don't think he made it to 9. He did get married. Frances Caroline Adams, Fanny, as she was called by everyone. They married in 1855. Like a lot of couples in the 19th century, they did endure the deaths of children, including the Garfields, including the Lincolns. They only had 2 of their children that survived to adulthood. And this was a difficult marriage. and it got more difficult as time went on, and I'll talk about that as we go through. When they were young, they were very much in love, but there were a number of things that happened over the years that led them to grow apart and to have some challenges in that marriage. They never divorced. They were married until she died in 1905, but it was a bit of a challenging marriage, to say the least. So when the Civil War began, this is a picture of what Chamberlain looked like as a young professor at Bowdoin. He has, as I said, a comfortable life. He's got a good job. I don't know if they had tenure at that point, but he's got a good job. He's at a place that he loves, Bowdoin, the place that means a lot to him. So he's got a good life. He's got a wife. He's got young kids. He's got everything that we're told we're supposed to want to have in life. And yet, when the war begins, Chamberlain, who's at this point about 33 years old, so still a relatively young man, feels the desire and the urge to do his part. And so he goes to the administration at Bowdoin and talks about wanting to at least offer his services to the governor. Because remember, this is the Civil War, so we're talking about volunteers. So a lot of times people like Chamberlain would actually write directly to the governor and volunteer to serve the state. And so Chamberlain approaches the administration at Bowdoin about offering his services to the governor of Maine, and of course the college says, absolutely not, we need you here. Understandable. Chamberlain, however, has just gotten a promotion at Bowdoin, and one of the things he's entitled to with this promotion is a sabbatical. So he had been talking about maybe going to Europe and doing some studying there, and he, in the back of his mind, is well aware that the sabbatical is coming, and who's to say how he uses the sabbatical. He was talking about going to Europe, but maybe he doesn't necessarily have to do that. So Bowdoin doesn't want him to leave, and perhaps even more importantly, his wife doesn't want him to leave. She wants him to stay home. She doesn't understand why he would leave this comfortable life, why he would leave her and these young children to go off and fight in a war that, in her mind at least, has really nothing to do with him. So she is not supportive of him leaving to join the army. And so between his employer not wanting him to go and his wife not wanting him to go, Chamberlain has a number of people that are telling him, we need you here, don't go. And of course he goes anyway. So this is a quote from the letter he wrote to the governor of Maine. This was in July of 1862, so the war had already been going on for about 15 months at this point. And I love this letter. And again, he reminds me of James Garfield here in so many ways. I have always been interested in military matters, and what I do not know in that line, I know how to learn. Did I mention that he spoke 9 other languages? Clearly, his aptitude for learning is pretty amazing. Having been lately elected to a new department, I am expecting to have leave at the approaching commencement to spend a year or more in Europe in the service of the college. I am entirely unwilling, however, to accept this offer if my country needs my service or example here. Your Excellency, meaning the governor, who he's writing to, presides over the educational as well as the military affairs of our state, and I am well aware appreciates the importance of sustaining our institutions of learning. You will therefore be able to decide where my influence is most needed. So the governor of Maine could have very easily said, no, you're probably better off staying at Bowdoin. We need you there. The governor obviously didn't do that. I fear this war, so costly of blood and treasure, will not cease until the men of the North are willing to leave good positions and sacrifice the dearest personal interests to rescue our country from desolation and defend the national existence against treachery at home and abroad. This war must be ended with a swift and strong hand, and every man ought to come forward and ask to be placed at his proper post. So like millions and millions of men, North and South alike, Chamberlain is basically volunteering to fight if he's needed. And of course, he's needed. So he's offered command of a new regiment, and I think in a pretty bold stroke of self-awareness says, I'm probably not ready for that just yet. Now again, this is the Civil War, so he's not going into the army as a private. He's educated, he's somewhat politically connected, like somebody like, say, James Garfield. He's going in, he's going to the governor's going to give him commission as an officer. So he's offered a colonel's rank and the command of a regiment. He says, I'm probably not ready to be in charge yet. And so he's appointed as a lieutenant colonel and the second in command of a new regiment called the 20th Maine, which, of course, goes on to great fame. So the regimental commander is this guy at the bottom here, Adelbert Ames. Great name, Adelbert. Good thing I didn't know that name when my son was born, or he might be Adelbert. I'm not sure. I don't know that he would appreciate that. So Ames is a fascinating guy. He's a West Pointer. He graduated from West Point in 1861, so really right as the war is starting, Ames graduates from West Point. He's commissioned in the artillery. West Point actually graduated 2 classes in 1861 because the war had started. They actually accelerated one of the classes, and so there were actually 2 West Point classes of 1861. He was in the first class that graduated in May of 61 on time, and then there was another class that graduated just a month or so later in June of 61. So Ames graduates from West Point, is commissioned into the artillery, and immediately is sent to fight in the Civil War. Fights at First Manassas, the first major battle of the war in July of 1861, and eventually receives the Medal of Honor for actions at First Manassas. So Ames is the guy who is going to be the commander of the 20th Maine, with Lieutenant Colonel Joshua Chamberlain as his second in command. And this was a very, very good move for Chamberlain to be placed under Ames, because Ames, even though he's very young and he's brand new, to the Army, he's very knowledgeable, he's a very stern disciplinarian, and he's the guy that really turns the 20th Maine into soldiers. So by the time Chamberlain takes over the regiment, a year or so later, the regiment has a lot of discipline and at that point has some battle experience as well. So Chamberlain, when he finally takes over the regiment, is not taking over a brand new regiment full of green soldiers who've never heard a shot fired in anger. He's taking over a regiment full of veterans. So Ames is the guy that really makes the 20th Maine into what it needs to be. And as a side note, Ames is fascinating, survives the war, becomes the military governor of Mississippi after the war, and then is elected governor as a radical Republican in Mississippi after the war, and is the last Republican governor of Mississippi until like the 1980s. And he lives into the 1930s. He was the last surviving general officer of the Civil War. So he lived well into his 90s. But anyway, a fascinating guy in his own right. But we're here to talk about Chamberlain, so I'll try to get back on track. Chamberlain, of course, as I told you at the beginning, was the oldest of 5. One of his brothers, right here to the left, Thomas Chamberlain, who is also portrayed in the Gettysburg film, also joined the 20th Maine, and so fought alongside his brother, joined as a lieutenant, and eventually became his brother's aide once his brother became the commander of the regiment. So this is Thomas Chamberlain here, and then the other brother, who unfortunately I couldn't find a picture of, was John Chamberlain. So John Chamberlain did not fight in the 20th Maine. He actually went and served with the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was akin to something similar to like the Red Cross. Basically provided aid to wounded soldiers. So John Chamberlain served with the Sanitary Commission. John Chamberlain did, however, visit his brothers with the 20th Maine from time to time, including not too long before the Battle of Gettysburg. So the first battle experience that the 20th Maine has is at Fredericksburg. That's in December of 1862. Fredericksburg is notable as one of the worst Union defeats of the entire war. Fredericksburg is the battle where, Ambrose Burnside, who was commanding the Army of the Potomac at that point, sent thousands and thousands and thousands of, massed Union regiments against Confederates up on Marye's Heights. And basically the Confederates just decimated them. This is the battle where, Robert E. Lee supposedly is sitting on his horse watching this absolute destruction of the Union Army, and supposedly says, it's good that war is so terrible or we would grow too fond of it, because they're just absolutely decimating these thousands of Union soldiers. So this is the 20th Maine's first time in battle. They don't take a lot of casualties, but they do get, like a lot of other regiments, get kind of pinned down between the lines, the Confederates up here on the high ground and then the rest of the Union back here. So they actually have to spend the night of December 13th, 1862, after the battle, sort of pinned down on the field. and Chamberlain later wrote about covering himself up with dead bodies, not only to try to stay warm, but also because the Confederates were still shooting, and to try to protect himself from Confederate bullets. So that's quite a baptism by fire for a brand new regiment that is experiencing its first time in battle. Now, the next big battle after Fredericksburg was Chancellorsville. That was in later April, early May of 1863. And the 20th Maine was not engaged at Chancellorsville because there was a smallpox outbreak in the regiment. So they were actually quarantined and didn't get a chance to fight at Chancellorsville. And they were assigned to, some sort of menial rear guard duty, guarding telegraph lines, that kind of thing, supply lines, that kind of stuff. Really just to get them out of the way and keep them busy, and also get them away from everybody else because there was smallpox in the regiment. So there was no action for the 20th Maine at Chancellorsville, and perhaps that's fortuitous because Chancellorsville is also a very significant Confederate victory. So we have Fredericksburg in December of 1862, and then we have Chancellorsville in May of 1863, and again, for the second time in a row, the Confederates just kind of wipe the Union right off the field. Significantly, though, the Confederacy did have one major loss at Chancellorsville, and that, of course, was Stonewall Jackson. This is the battle at which Jackson was accidentally wounded by his own men and had his arm amputated and eventually died about a week later. So shortly after Chancellorsville is when Colonel Ames, Adelbert Ames, leaves the 20th Maine. He gets a promotion to Brigadier General, and he's assigned to command a brigade in the 11th Corps. Now, the 11th Corps, also commanded by a Bowdoin graduate, Oliver Howard, who I mentioned earlier. The 11th Corps really got decimated at Chancellorsville. It was the 11th Corps that was holding the flank that was attacked by Jackson's troops at Chancellorsville, and the 11th Corps also was made up by a lot of German units, so soldiers who didn't really speak much English. And in all of the confusion of this surprise attack that they endured at Chancellorsville, a lot of them retreated. And so they were kind of negatively referred to as the Flying Dutchmen. Now, of course, they weren't speaking Dutch; they were speaking German, but whatever. But it was obviously had a negative connotation that they cut and ran in the heat of battle. So Ames, who again is a strict disciplinarian and a very, very accomplished soldier, even at a very young age, is sent from the 20th Maine, promoted to Brigadier General, and sent to command a brigade in the 11th Corps. They were also called Howard's Cowards, by the way, because again, Howard was the commander of the 11th Corps. Also from Maine, also a graduate of Bowdoin. Howard went on to fame as the first head of the Freedmen's Bureau after the war ended. So shortly before the Battle of Gettysburg in June of 1863, Chamberlain then is promoted to full colonel and is given command of the 20th Maine. So at this point, he's been a soldier for almost a year, has learned a lot under Ames, and now is the commander of the 20th Maine. The position he was initially offered a year before when he first wrote to the governor of Maine now is his as commander of the 20th. So it's Gettysburg, of course, is the battle at which Chamberlain gains the most fame and the 20th Maine gains the most fame. And on the second day of the battle, of course, the first day ends. The lines are fairly established. You've got the Union line in blue here. It's supposed to be the fish hook, the famous Gettysburg fish hook, with starting with the 12th Corps here over in Culp's Hill, and then coming all the way down here, so you can kind of see the shape of the hook here, although it's kind of screwy here, and I'll explain that in a second. Supposed to be coming all the way down here to the Round Tops. It's supposed to be where the left flank of the Union Army is going to begin the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg. And then, of course, here come the Confederates on the first day, pushing the Union really from this side of town back through the town and establishing this fish hook line. So on the morning of the second day, the Union is supposed to be in that fish hook shape. But everything changes. This guy right here, Dan Sickles, is the commander of the Union 3rd Corps. So Sickles is supposed to have his corps in position right here, kind of the end of the fish hook. His left flank is basically supposed to be right around the Round Tops here. And as the morning wears on, before the fighting for the day begins, Sickles keeps looking out towards the Emmitsburg Road and seeing areas like the peach orchard and the wheat field. and likes that ground better. Now, it doesn't, if you know the terrain of Gettysburg at all, it doesn't make a lot of sense because his flank is firmly ensconced on high ground at Little Round Top. So what do we know about Sickles? First of all, he had a very bad experience at Chancellorsville where, in his mind, this was a very similar situation. There was an area at Chancellorsville called Hazel Grove that Sickles kept asking his commanders, could he please advance his troops to take Hazel Grove because it was a perfect place for Confederate artillery. He was told no, and guess what? The Confederates got up there, and sure enough, they set artillery on Hazel Grove, and they had very negative effects on Sickles and his troops, to say the least, at Chancellorsville. So here's Sickles on the morning of July 2nd looking out and thinking about Hazel Grove, seeing the peach orchard, seeing the wheat field, and asking General Meade, George Gordon Meade, the new commander of the Army of the Potomac, who's been in charge for a total of about 4 days at this point. So he was new to his command just like Joshua Chamberlain was. Sickles is constantly sending word back to Meade, asking for permission to move his corps forward to take these spots. And of course, Meade, being a professional soldier, a West Pointer who knows how to read a map, is looking at this line saying, no, that makes no sense. You're on high ground here on your flank. Stay where you are. So what do we know about Sickles? In addition to the Hazel Grove experience, Sickles is not a West Pointer. He's not a professional soldier. What did Sickles do before the war? He's a politician. He's a congressman. He's a member of Congress. He's a Democrat from New York City. And like a lot of soldiers, including guys like Chamberlain, Garfield, he's a political officer, meaning he got his position because he was educated, he was politically connected, whatever. He's not a professional soldier. A lot of those political generals, as they call them, acquitted themselves pretty well. Not all of them. And certainly Gettysburg, depending on who you ask, was not Sickles' finest hour. If you ask Sickles, he would say he won the battle. But anyway, that's a whole other story. Sickles also, by the way, completely unrelated to Gettysburg, is fascinating as the very first guy who ever beat a murder charge with the temporary insanity defense in the United States. Found out his wife was having an affair, walked out onto the street and killed the guy she was having the affair with, who, oh, by the way, was the son of Francis Scott Key. Went to trial for murder. His lawyer was a guy named Edwin Stanton, who was later Secretary of War under Lincoln. And they used the temporary insanity defense and beat the rap. And he was the first guy in the United States ever to successfully beat a murder charge with the temporary insanity defense. Anyway, this is about 4 years in the past by the time Gettysburg rolls around. So Sickles eventually decides, oh, the heck with it, and on his own moves his corps forward without orders from Meade. And of course, Meade, when he hears about this, actually rides out to find Sickles and says, what do you think you're doing? And right about that time is when the Confederates start their attack. So by moving his corps forward off of this line right here and moving them forward to this line right here, Sickles has created what we refer to as a salient, an opening in the line. And of course, Longstreet's troops are massed down here, and they are going to try to exploit that salient and get through and get around the rear of the Union lines. It's really fairly simple. It's not, they're not splitting the atom here. We're talking about, seeing there's a wide open gap right here, and he's going to try to send troops flowing through that gap to get into the rear of the Union lines. So at this point, the attack now, the Confederate attack begins. Sickles cannot move his soldiers back as Meade wants him to do. So Meade says, well, I guess we're stuck. We're going to have to fight it out this way. So really, it's Dan Sickles who inadvertently makes Joshua Chamberlain a hero at the Battle of Gettysburg. Then there's this guy, Gouverneur K. Warren, who was the chief engineer of the Army of the Potomac. So Warren is riding back and forth on his horse, basically scouting the lines. And he's the guy that eventually realized, we've got a problem here because this high ground, what we now call Little Round Top, is now unoccupied. So Warren is the guy, and of course this is the statue of Warren on Little Round Top at Gettysburg. Again, depending on who you ask, some people consider Warren the savior of Little Round Top, some people think it's Strong Vincent, some people think it's Joshua Chamberlain, so who knows. But at any rate, Warren is the guy who realizes that Little Round Top is unoccupied and sends for troops, any troops, doesn't matter who, any troops, to hold this hill until he can get more reinforcements up to the hill. And so he sends a messenger out to basically find anybody he can, and the messenger finds Strong Vincent's brigade. So this is Strong Vincent. What a great name for a soldier, Strong. Boy, you don't get better than that. Vincent is from Pennsylvania. He's from Erie, PA, not far from here, and is actually, like Chamberlain, is an educated guy, went to Harvard, was a lawyer in civilian life, and then when the war began, joined the Army. So he's commanding the 3rd Brigade, 1st Division, 5th Corps, that's Sykes Corps, and his regiment, or his brigade rather, is made up of these 4 regiments: the 16th Michigan, 83rd Pennsylvania, which Vincent had commanded at one point, the 44th New York, and of course the 20th Maine. And so Vincent basically, when he encounters Warren's messenger, says, I will take my brigade to the hill, we'll hold the hill until you can get more reinforcements to us. So this is a picture of Vincent here. This is the 3rd Brigade's flag. And then, of course, this photo here shows, I'm going to ruin the story here for you, shows the spot on which Vincent was mortally wounded. And that's kind of hard to see, but in the background there is the monument to the 44th New York, the famous castle monument up on Little Round Top that you can actually go up into and get a great view of Devil's Den and all that. So Vincent brings his brigade up to the hill and positions them, as you see here. This is Vincent's brigade. So the 16th Michigan is holding the right. He's got the 44th New York and the 83rd Pennsylvania in the middle. And then on the very left is the 20th Maine. That's Chamberlain's regiment. So at this point, Joshua Chamberlain and his roughly 400 to 500 men from Maine are the left flank of the entire Union Army. And I say, a full-strength Civil War regiment's roughly 1,000 men, but through, fighting at Fredericksburg and through the smallpox epidemic and dysentery and all these other terrible things that Civil War soldiers are dealing with, Chamberlain's regiment is down to about half strength. So he's got maybe 400 to 500 men that he is now using to hold the entire left flank of the Union Army. And so, of course, the reds here represent the Confederate troops that are trying to attack Little Round Top. And the main units that Chamberlain is going to be going up against are the 15th and 47th Alabama. There's some Texas troops mixed in there as well, but the Alabamans are the ones that Chamberlain is really going to be facing off with this in this battle. And as you can see, it makes sense. The Confederates are trying to get around the Union flank because, of course, once they get around the Union flank, they can just roll right up the hill. They can take Little Round Top. At this point, held by only this one brigade. And then, just like they did at Hazel Grove, they can get artillery up there, and then they can drop artillery all the way down the Union line, all the way to Cemetery Hill and beyond. So, the Confederate strategy here is sound. It makes sense, trying to get around the Union flank and take Little Round Top. So Chamberlain is here with the 20th Maine, holding the entire left. He does something very smart, which is he detaches one company under a captain named Walter Morrill, and he sends that company off kind of into the woods, really just to prevent the Southerners from getting completely around the flank. So he does dispatch that one company of troops under Captain Walter G. Morrill, Morrill, to off into the woods there. They do then get involved later as the battle unfolds. So here you see again a more close-up view from the map of the units coming after Chamberlain. You can see Chamberlain starting to bend his line back here. This is the scene in the film where the Confederate troops charge up the hill, the 20th Maine repulses them, and then the Confederate troops gather up, and then they charge up the hill again. And this happens multiple times over the course of the late afternoon and early evening of July 2nd. Chamberlain continues to, is continuing to lose soldiers. He's running low on ammunition, and he is continuing to do everything he can to hold that flank. At one point, he actually extends his line, because Civil War armies fight in ranks, right? Keep in mind, we're talking about weapons here that could fire maybe 3 rounds a minute if you're lucky. So one rank would fire, and then they would kneel down and start to reload, and then the second rank behind them would shoot, and then they would do the same, and the rank behind them would shoot, and by the time the third guys shoot, hopefully the first guys are just about done, and they can get up and shoot again. So at this point, things are getting so desperate for Chamberlain that he extends his line. He makes the line longer. So the line that started right here now is being bent back and made longer, but the line being made longer means it doesn't have as much depth. So if the Confederates break through this line, they're basically going to break through. And so Chamberlain's doing everything he can. And then eventually, after 6 or 7 charges up the hill by the Confederates, the 20th Maine is out of options. They're out of ammunition. They've lost so many soldiers that they don't have enough strength to really fight off another attack. And so this is where we get the famous charge down the hill. Now, there's some debate about what actually happened here. Initially, everybody was on board with Chamberlain ordering this very arcane, very complicated, what they call right wheel forward. That's what happens in the movie, by the way, where he's telling Ellis Spear, his second in command, who also went to Bowdoin, by the way, we're going to do this, we're going to swing like a door. So, we're all going to run down the hill, and then at some point we're going to start to pivot, and we're going to sweep these rebels right off the hill. That is not exactly how it happened. And then Chamberlain himself, much later on, admitted he never really ordered a right wheel forward. It just kind of happened organically. There's also some speculation that the charge was not really a charge at all. It began with a lieutenant named Holman Melcher asking Chamberlain if he could move his company forward just long enough to pick up some of the wounded. So this would have been between the Confederate attacks. The Confederates retreat. Everybody knows they're going to come again soon. Melcher then supposedly goes to Chamberlain and asks for permission to take his company forward just to drag in some of the 20th Maine's wounded back into the lines. Chamberlain says, okay. And then as they're moving forward is when the Confederates came back again and the rest of the regiment just kind of charged organically. That's possible. We're not exactly sure what happened. Again, Chamberlain did admit later on there was never really an order for a right wheel forward. It just kind of happened that way because as the regiment is charging, as part of the regiment is charging down the hill, this part right here, they have no choice but to kind of swing around to continue to try to take these rebels out. And this is the point also where Morrill's Company B comes in and helps and gets involved in the charge as well. And if you go to Gettysburg today, if you go up to Little Round Top, you find the 20th Maine's marker, which is very easy to find because there's always a million people around it. You can actually walk into the woods there and you can find the marker for Company B as well. It is out there. You have to look for it, but it's there. So eventually, yes, the 20th Maine kind of sweeps the rebels off of the field. And at that point, it's getting late in the day, and there are no more Confederate attacks, at least on Chamberlain's section of the line, and so the Union left is secure. So the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg is clearly a Confederate victory. The second day is just that close for the Confederates. Just that close. They came, literally one regiment kept them from accomplishing their objective on the second day, which was turning the Union's left flank. And so then, of course, on the third day, Robert E. Lee says, okay, well, they've got to be weak somewhere. It must be the middle, and that's where we get Pickett's charge. 12,000 Confederate infantry walking a mile across open ground. And there's a great scene in the movie where, after this battle is over, they relieve the 20th Maine and tell them, you guys did a great job, go to the center and just relax. And then, of course, the next day is Pickett's charge, and we have this massive artillery duel. As far as I know, that did happen. The 20th Maine was basically sent to the rear in the center of the line, thinking that, nothing's going to happen there. And then, of course, they come under heavy artillery fire during the artillery barrage that precedes Pickett's charge. But this, of course, is the move that Joshua Chamberlain and the 20th Maine are most famous for. This is a Mort Kunstler print of Chamberlain leading the 20th Maine down the hill. This print here is one of the ones that Mort Kunstler did when the Gettysburg film came out back in the early 90s. And you'll notice when you look at, and there's a whole book full of these paintings that he did sort of as related to the film, that the the soldiers tend to look like the actors that were playing them in the film. So if you get it real close to this, it looks like Jeff Daniels. If you look at a portrait of Robert E. Lee that he did, then it looks like Martin Sheen, and Longstreet looks like Tom Berenger and all the rest. So after Gettysburg, Chamberlain obviously is highly regarded for holding the flank. He does get some time off because he gets sick, as was very common among Civil War soldiers. These gastrointestinal issues that were very common in Civil War camps, dysentery and malaria. So he's gone for a number of months trying to heal up from all of these ailments. Comes back to the Army in early 1864 and is assigned command not back to the 20th Maine, but of a brigade. So he doesn't get promoted to brigadier general yet. He's still a colonel, but he's given command of a brigade of the 5th Corps, the same corps that he was part of, but not the same brigade. So he's not commanding the 20th Maine at this point. And of course, the siege of Petersburg. At this point, Grant has come from the west to the east. He's in charge, and Grant and Lee are really slugging it out in Virginia. And one of the places where they do that is Petersburg, and so that's where Chamberlain goes next. And on June 18th of 1864, Chamberlain's leading a charge against the fields. And this is obviously not a photo; it's a painting, but. Petersburg is famous for really kind of like almost an early version of trench warfare like we saw in World War I, decades later. So Chamberlain is leading this charge, and they're running sort of over these trenches, and he takes a very, very serious wound. He's shot through the right hip, and the bullet, as Civil War bullets tended to do, really kind of rattles around inside his body and ends up nicking his bladder. And he basically had to wear, a catheter with a bag really for the rest of his life because of the damage that was done inside his body by this bullet. And he actually props himself up on his sword and continues to sort of send his men forward until he finally passes out from loss of blood. When he gets back to the medical area, he's expected to die. Doctors think he's injured enough that he's not going to make it. And Gouverneur K. Warren, who was, if you recall, was the guy that found the Little Round Top unoccupied at Gettysburg, at this point, by the time of Petersburg, is the commander of the 5th Corps. And so Warren sends off a note to U.S. Grant, telling him what's happened to Chamberlain and suggesting that Chamberlain be promoted because he's going to die soon. And so Grant actually promotes Chamberlain to brigadier general, and then guess what? Chamberlain ruins the story by living. So he survives. He doesn't die. Everybody thought he was going to die. Supposedly this was the first time Grant had ever given a promotion like this, but because they thought he was not going to make it, they made this promotion. And at least one newspaper in Maine actually reported that he had in fact died. Clearly he had not. He was sent back to Washington, D.C., where he recuperated for months and months. His wife comes down from Maine to help care for him, and she tries to convince him that you've done enough, come home. And Chamberlain doesn't feel that he should do that. The war is still going on, and he feels like he should continue to serve until the war is over. There's some very good, medical historians out there that have looked at this case and suggest that one of the reasons perhaps that the marriage was strained, we're all adults here, is that in all likelihood this wound left Chamberlain impotent. And so that is at least one potential reason that the marriage, which was already difficult because she didn't agree with his decision to go to the Army in the first place, now he's been almost lost his life and still won't come home. And then there's this very strong possibility that he was impotent for the rest of his life. So the marriage does remain very, very difficult. The wound also requires him to undergo surgery constantly for the rest of his life. And in fact, even though he lives another almost 50 years, it's really ultimately complications from this wound that end up killing him when he's in his 80s. So this wound troubles him for the rest of his life. And he's constantly undergoing more surgeries, not only to try to sort of clean out the wound, but also to try to not have to use a catheter, an early version of a catheter. So he does undergo multiple surgeries over the course of the rest of his life. But back to the end of the Civil War, he comes back to the Army in the spring of 1865. This is as the war is winding down, and he's there for the real last push against the Confederates. He takes another serious wound right as the war is ending, almost has his arm amputated. He gets a brevet promotion to brigadier, or to major general rather. A brevet is basically an honorary promotion. I liken it as, you know, hey, that's where they say you get more responsibility, but we're still going to pay you the same amount, because that's basically what it is. He's still being paid as a brigadier general, but he's got the responsibility of a major general. And of course, the Confederates surrender. The Army of Northern Virginia surrenders on April 9th, and then famously on April 12th, 3 days later, also the 4th anniversary of the attack on Fort Sumter, the Army of Northern Virginia ceremonially surrenders, and they stack arms, and Chamberlain is the officer that's given the honor of being in charge of that ceremony, and he famously calls his men to attention and, you know, gives a salute to the Confederates as they're passing by and as they're going to stack arms as a defeated army. And so Chamberlain is somewhat highly regarded in the South for the respect that he showed to the Confederates during the time that they were you know, surrendering and getting ready to be paroled and return home at the war's end. So by the time the war ends, Chamberlain is a brevet major general, fought in 20 battles, cited for bravery 4 times, 6 horses shot out from under him, 6 wounds in action, the most serious being the Petersburg wound, of course, the wound that nearly cost him his arm. He was wounded in the foot at Gettysburg, so he's wounded several times. And he's offered, you know, he's made enough of an impression that, you know, as the war is ending, you know, keep in mind what the size of the U.S. Army was prior to the Civil War. It's a very small organization spread out primarily in the West. And everybody expects that's what it's going to go back to when the Civil War ends. Chamberlain is offered a spot in the regular army after the war. And he doesn't take it. I guess he finally decided that, you know, he'd done enough and it was time to go home. I think he should have taken it. I think the rest of his life, he probably would have been a lot happier. I think he was far more himself in the Army than he was anywhere else. Because for the rest of his life, and he lived a lot of years yet, he seemed, to me at least, to be somewhat restless. You know, after all of this fighting and this action and you know, this real life or death struggle, going back to being a college professor, kind of a letdown, at least for somebody like him. A lot of people would have said, oh, thank God I'm back to being a college professor. But Chamberlain kind of thrived on this, and you know, the idea of going back to being a teacher or something like that just wasn't appealing to him. So where else could somebody of Chamberlain's stature try to find action after the war? Of course, where else? Politics. And so even though he had been a Democrat prior to the war, he became a Republican after the war, and was a very attractive political candidate because of his war record. And so he becomes governor of Maine in 1866. Maine had some weird elections at this point where governors only served for a year. They had to run for re-election every year. So he's elected to 4 consecutive one-year terms as the governor of Maine. Again, his marriage is difficult. His wife does not want him to be in politics, and she refuses to move to Augusta, which is the capital of Maine, refuses to move there with him. So he's all alone while he's in Augusta as the governor, and he's, you know, frankly, fairly unhappy. I think he's just, you know, it's not what he was hoping that it would be. He's by himself. He misses his children. He misses his wife. And so it just is not what he wanted it to be. This was also the period when Chamberlain started to write quite a bit and also started to lecture quite a bit. And as years went on, he became very, very popular on the lecture circuit. And keep in mind, you know, he's this very educated guy. He speaks all these different languages. He taught rhetoric at one point. He's very good with words, and his speeches are very much in demand. If you read some of them today, some of them are so rhetorical and so flowery with this 19th century Victorian language that some of them can almost seem nonsensical. But in this era, he was very highly regarded as a speaker, and part of that was because he was so intelligent and he did have this great command of the language. So he served those 4 terms as governor, 4 one-year terms. After he was governor, he was offered the presidency of his alma mater, Bowdoin College, which he accepted. He did that job for the next 12 years until 1883. He opened the curriculum up quite a bit, really, I think, strengthened what we would think of today as the liberal arts. But he also had some disappointments as the head of Bowdoin College. And in one case, he decided that all Bowdoin students should participate in military-style drills. He was very concerned about readiness for another conflict. And of course, the students didn't want to do this, and the faculty didn't agree with him. And so he felt like the faculty kind of stabbed him in the back by not supporting him. So I think he had some disappointments during his time at Bowdoin as well, and these things to me are just kind of adding to his sort of general dissatisfaction with a lot of aspects of his life after the Civil War. He resigned in 1883 from the presidency of Bowdoin, citing his health. What he really wanted was to be a U.S. senator. So he was hoping, again, this is, you know, the late 19th century. Voters don't directly elect their own senators at this point. They're elected by state legislatures under the original system enumerated in the Constitution. And so he was hoping that the Maine legislature would send him to the Senate. And there were a number of times over the next several years that he thought this was a possibility, and it never came to be. So he was disappointed in that as well. Now, of course, I do have to get another Garfield connection in here. June of 1881, really just a few weeks before Garfield is assassinated, Garfield was, in addition to dealing with his job as president and some pretty nasty struggles going on within the Republican Party, he's very concerned about his wife, Lucretia, who is sick with malaria. And so Chamberlain actually writes this letter to James Garfield, to President James Garfield, in June of 1881, suggesting that Garfield should bring Mrs. Garfield to Maine, because the climate there is so good. You know, the humidity is usually fairly low, I guess, in the summertime. And so he's suggesting that the Garfield should come to Maine, and that will help Mrs. Garfield heal from the malaria. And oh, by the way, if you happen to come, we'd love to have you at commencement at Bowdoin College too. So, because of course, you know, you can't do much better than getting the President of the United States to come and speak at your commencement. Garfield, you know, never, to my knowledge, responded to the letter. He was shot really just a little over 2 weeks later, and so there's no indication to me that Garfield and Chamberlain ever actually met or knew each other in any way. But we do have this great letter that Chamberlain wrote to Garfield, offering to help him find a place to stay if they decided to bring Mrs. Garfield to Maine to try to heal up from malaria. This is a photo from the dedication of the 20th Maine's monument at Gettysburg on Little Round Top. There's the monument right there in the background, and then here's Chamberlain right here with his white hair and his very impressive Jeff Daniels-like mustache right there sitting in the middle. Chamberlain, of course, not only as the former commander of the regiment, but as a very well-known educator and former governor, was the keynote speaker at the ceremony dedicating the 20th Maine's monument at Gettysburg. And that's just some of the texts that he used that day as he was speaking to his former comrades in arms. After he left the presidency of Bowdoin, he wrote. He went out and was, as I said, very popular on the Civil War lecture circuit. At one point, he moved to New York City trying to establish a law practice. He was a civil servant for a while, was the surveyor of the port of Portland up in Maine, speculated in real estate in Florida, invested in railroads, really was trying to, you know, kind of make his fortune as he started to get a little bit older. Great, you know, I think he looks very distinguished there with the white hair and the mustache. Great photo of Chamberlain there. And then, of course, in 1893, he did receive, 30 years after the Battle of Gettysburg, he received the Medal of Honor for his actions at Gettysburg in July of 1863. So this is the language of his Medal of Honor citation. This is what the Army version of the Medal of Honor looked like during the Civil War. And then, of course, this is the modern Army version. So Medal of Honor recipients at this time did actually get both versions. So he got one that looked just like this. And then when the design was changed in the early 20th century, he actually got one that looked like this as well. And so Chamberlain did, in fact, have 2 copies of the medal. One of them was lost, actually, and was just found. I think it was one of those stories where somebody bought a box at a yard sale or something, and it turned out his Medal of Honor was in the box. Well, that's now been donated to the local historical society up there in that area of Maine where he lived. And then his other, I think his second medal, this one is I think is at Bowdoin. I'm not sure about that. Now, during the Spanish-American War, a lot of Civil War veterans, who, of course, at this point, a lot of them, like Chamberlain, are well into their 70s, volunteered to fight again for the country. Many of them were accepted into service. Some of them were even sent to Cuba to fight. Chamberlain volunteered, but he was rejected because his health was so poor because of that Petersburg wound, and that was a big blow to his ego. That he was not able to serve again. Interestingly, though, a lot of the Civil War veterans that did serve in the Spanish-American War fought for the Confederacy in the Civil War, and one of them was William C. Oats. Oats was the commander of the 15th Alabama at Gettysburg. Oats was the guy leading his soldiers up Little Round Top, trying to turn the left flank of the Union Army that Chamberlain was holding with the 20th Maine. Oats also volunteered to fight, to serve in the United States Army in the Spanish-American War, and he was accepted. He actually was able to accepted back into the service. I don't recall if he actually was sent to Cuba to fight, but he was accepted back into the service. So you can imagine how Chamberlain felt about this, that the guy he beat at Gettysburg got to go back into the Army and serve during the Spanish-American War, and Chamberlain did not. Oats and Chamberlain also had another conflict later in life, late 19th, early 20th century. Oats wanted to build a monument to his regiment at Gettysburg. He wanted it, understandably, to be at Little Round Top. At this time, there was a Gettysburg Battle Monuments Commission that was in charge of approving or rejecting proposed monuments for the Gettysburg battlefield. And Oats was having a lot of trouble with these guys, getting them to approve his plan for a monument. And so he eventually wrote to Joshua Chamberlain, asking Chamberlain to please talk to the commission and give him permission to build his monument to the 15th Alabama. Chamberlain said, sure, makes sense. But then they got into this argument about where Oats wanted to put the monument. And basically, Oats wanted to put the monument in a place that Chamberlain said, no, you never got that far. And Oats says, of course, oh, yes, we did. And so then it kind of devolved into this sort of letter writing campaign that they went on against each other, and the monument was never built. But Oats, this was very personal to him, one, because he had commanded that regiment, but two, his own brother was killed at Gettysburg, fighting on Little Round Top against the 20th Maine. So he was very passionate about wanting to build this monument, and it never happened. Even today, there's still no monument there. And then, of course, Chamberlain, as I said, lived a very long life. He was still alive in 1913 when the very famous 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg was held. And he wanted to attend, but his health just was so bad at this point that he could not go. And so he was still alive at this point, but he lived until February 24th of 1914. So that's the reason I decided to do this program in February, because it coincides with Chamberlain's death. He for the last 10 years of his life was a widower. Fanny died in 1905. Their relationship continued to be strained. At one point, either while he was governor or shortly thereafter, she actually started the process of trying to get divorced. She accused him of spousal abuse, although that was never proven, and he even, there are letters surviving where he says to her, this never happened. But anyway, it was a very difficult relationship, but they did stay married until she died in 1905. And then, of course, to finish up, this is just a look at Pine Grove Cemetery in Brunswick, Maine, where Chamberlain is buried. So we have, the standard plain headstone here, but then this, of course, is the Medal of Honor headstone, to which all Medal of Honor recipients are entitled with the Medal of Honor insignia up here. So, that's a very quick lesson on the life of Joshua Chamberlain. A fascinating guy, a complicated guy. I still think he would have been better off to stay in the Army. Frankly, after the war, it might have cost him his marriage, which is not pleasant to think about, but that might have been better ultimately because they were not happy for a good part of their life together. I just feel like everything he did after the war, even though he did very well, I don't think anything measured up to him to that time he was in the Army. I think he was just more alive in the Army than he was at any other time. And so it's tragic that, you know, he spent decades afterwards trying to sort of recapture that period in his life. And I think, to me, that really also explains why he became so popular on the lecture circuit. I think Chamberlain, I'm getting into sort of psycho-history here, but I think because he was somewhat unhappy in his life, I think it was appealing to him to think back to the war and think about, you know, even though, yes, it's a life and death struggle, literally, and no one knew that better than him after all the wounds and everything that he suffered, it was understandable why he would continue to think about that and write about it and speak about it, because I think it was, I don't want to say the happiest time of his life, but I think it's the time in his life when he maybe felt more in touch with himself and like he was where he belonged. You know, there's also, just very quickly, because I know I'm pretty much out of time, and then I'll take questions. There's also some talk about, you know, was he a self-promoter, and, you know, how much of what he wrote about, especially Gettysburg, but other battles too, is true. Yeah, I think he probably was maybe a little bit of a self-promoter, but he certainly was not alone in that. There was a period in his life later where he was not on great terms with a lot of the guys that had fought under him in the 20th Maine, because they felt like every time he told the story about Gettysburg, it got a little better, and his role got a little bigger, and everybody else's got a little smaller. You know, when you think about, you know, how long some of these guys lived, and you know, their memories are starting to not be as strong, but also somebody like Chamberlain, who I think just was looking back on this time in his life with kind of rose-colored glasses, yeah, maybe it's a little bit understandable. But regardless of whether or not he was a self-promoter, he didn't need to be a self-promoter, because I think he was a very impressive person, certainly an incredible military career, even though a short one. And you know, I do think some great parallels with somebody like James Garfield, who also was an academic, who also thought about becoming a minister, who also, you know, pored over books trying to learn how to be a soldier. And, you know, by most accounts acquitted himself pretty well in battle too, although I don't think Garfield's war record can match that of somebody like Chamberlain. So I'll take questions now. I know you've been trying. I'm sorry.
Yeah, was he an abolitionist, or did he get one of the soldiers?
That's a great question. So if you watch the film, there's all these great scenes of Chamberlain talking about, you know, we're fighting to make other men free, and, you know, everyone in this country has value. He gives all these very moralistic speeches. Prior to the war, at least, he was a Democrat. He was not a Republican. He was not an abolitionist. I don't think he was in favor of slavery. I think he just really never expressed much of an opinion one way or the other. After the war, when he comes home from the Army and he decides to run for governor, he becomes a Republican because that was political expediency. You know, the Democrats then are being painted, you know, somewhat justifiably as the party of secession, the party of slavery, the party that, you know, tried to destroy the country. So it would not have been a good idea to go home, and especially as a war hero, and try to run as a Democrat. No, I don't think he was necessarily an abolitionist. I wouldn't say he was in favor of slavery. I don't know, quite frankly. He never seemed to say much about that. That's one of the areas where I think people get drawn in by the character of Chamberlain that was created in The Killer Angels, and then again in the film, where he makes all of these, you know, wonderful speeches that about, you know, setting other men free and all this stuff. And to my knowledge, at least, never really expressed those sentiments one way or the other. But I don't know that he was strictly an abolitionist now. Sure.
No, I'm going on the premise of the movie.
Sure.
When they led the charge down, did they in fact fix bayonets to instill fear to the Confederates?
Well, it depends on which version of the story you want to believe. In the version you get in the movie, yes, they fix bayonets. In fact, there's that very dramatic scene where Chamberlain orders them to fix bayonets, which is a great scene, by the way. I think there's no question that a lot of them did have bayonets fixed already when they charged, simply because the Confederates had come this close several times to breaking through their lines anyway. So even prior to there actually being a charge, whether there was an ordered charge and or it just happened organically, a lot of those guys were fighting with bayonets on the ends of their muskets anyway because the Confederates were getting so close to breaking through. Whether or not, Chamberlain ever gave an order, fix bayonets and then right wheel forward and all that, that's a little more kind of up in the air. But certainly I think if there was enough time to fix bayonets as they were charging, they certainly would have done that. But I think a lot of them went down the hill with bayonets simply because they had them on already. Because of just how close this fight was getting. Every time the Confederates charged, they got a little bit closer because the 20th Maine, they're inflicting a lot of casualties, but they're taking a lot of casualties too. And I think there definitely were bayonets on the ends of the muskets for the most part as they charged down the hill. Whether or not that was because they were ordered to fix bayonets or they just had them on anyway because of the close nature of that battle, I'm not sure.
One more.
Sure.
Just trying to authenticate.
Sure.
There was some talk that this wouldn't have came into fruition if the Confederates weren't coming down Taneytown Road in search of shoes.
Oh, yeah. You went the first day. Well, yeah, I mean, there's some, yes, that's an overly simplified way to look at that the Battle of Gettysburg was fought because Confederates needed shoes. The Confederates needed all kinds of supplies. I mean, they were operating far from outside their own territory. I mean, they're in Pennsylvania. And the whole reason they were coming north was not only to scare the Union and try to convince them to negotiate peace, but was to try to give the farmers in the South a break to let them grow something because the war had just decimated the South, especially Virginia. So the Confederates needed a lot of supplies. So yes, certainly on the first day, some of those brigade commanders like Heth, for example, that asked for permission to go towards Gettysburg looking for supplies. Shoes are mentioned, but they're also looking for food, they're looking for ammunition, they also are trying to do a little reconnaissance and see who's in town because they think there's some Union militia there. So there's a lot of reasons that they kind of went into Gettysburg on the first day. Shoes, supplies in general, I would say, is one of those reasons, yeah. So we'll be here again, always on the second Wednesday of the month. And next month, one of our staff, Dan McGill, will be here to talk about the history of the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Cleveland. So